Good evening, I'm Katie Wilson and you are watching A News. Here are your top stories for tonight. He charmed the world with his humility and his concern for the poor. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. Catholics, religious leaders and heads of state around the world mourn the pontiff's passing. Rites and rituals are set in motion as the Vatican moves towards electing a new pope. Pope Francis, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88. The Vatican released a solemn message praising his lifelong service and unwavering commitment to peace and the poor. After the announcement, bells rang out from the Vatican to mark his passing.
Bells sounded in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican on Monday after the passing of Pope Francis. Faithfuls from all over the world have gathered in Vatican, expressing shock and grief at the death of the first Latin American pontiff. Vatican issued a short video statement regarding Pope's death. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Vatican Camerlengo, read a short message announcing the passing of the 88-year-old pontiff.
La sua vita tutta intera.
His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and marginalized. With immense gratitude for his example of a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the triune God.
Pope Francis was 88 and had recently survived a serious bout of double pneumonia. Outside the Vatican, tourists and pilgrims visiting for Easter reacted with sorrow and disbelief to the news of the Pope's death.
It's a great disappointment, a great loss, a man who has innovated the church and a man who has left a great mark. And his absence causes great pain.
We feel very emotional actually. We're just here for holiday and we can't believe it's happened while we're here. You know, he was a lovely pope. We're very sad about it.
I think it was a great pope. I think that every Christian people must come here to say goodbye, to farewell to him these days, and especially because he is the first person against wars. He would like the peace in the world.
Pope's death came as a shock after he had been driven around St. Peter's Square in an open-air Pope-mobile to greet cheering crowds on Easter Sunday.
Well, tributes are pouring in from all over the world following the news of Pope Francis's death. Dignitaries, religious figures and international organisations are reflecting on the pontiff's legacy and spiritual leadership.
Pope Francis, the leader of more than a billion followers around the world, has died.
Pope Francis has died.
Fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
Pope Francis, the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has died. His death has prompted an outpouring of tributes from global leaders, religious figures, and communities around the world. US President Donald Trump paid tribute to Pope Francis in a social media post on Truth Social. He said, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis." US Vice President J.D. Vance, who met Pope Francis just a day before his passing, expressed deep sorrow. He said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him." French President Emmanuel Macron honoured Pope Francis's lifelong commitment to unity and environmental harmony.
the Holy Father is no more. I want to express, first of all, my most sincere condolences to all Catholics around the world, express our support to them. It would be difficult for me to go into much more detail here and to go over the entirety of his pontificate and what Pope Francis brought from Argentina to the Vatican, but it was the vocation of a man, a religious figure, of a bishop, then of a cardinal and a pope who, throughout his life, fought for greater justice.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described him as an inspiration far beyond the Catholic Church. She added that her thoughts are with all those who feel this profound loss. President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan also expressed deep sorrow over the passing of Pope Francis, praising him as a revered global religious leader dedicated to peace, interfaith dialogue and humanism. Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting, Friedrich Merz, wrote on X that Pope Francis will be remembered for his tireless commitment to the weakest members of our society. In Moscow, the Kremlin announced that President Vladimir Putin has sent official condolences. In a message addressed to Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell, the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, Putin wrote that throughout the years of Pope Francis's pontificate, he actively promoted dialogue between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described the head of the Catholic Church as a devoted champion and a loving father.
He was very much a modernist. His message that he sent out echoed in our region during his historic visit to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Singapore and Timor-Leste. The first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere was close to the people of Australia. For Australian Catholics, he was a devoted champion and loving father.
Israel's President Isaac Herzog called him a man of deep faith and boundless compassion.
I want to use this podium to share my deepest condolences with the Christian world, the Catholic world, and with the Christian communities here in Israel, the Holy Land, and Catholics in the United States for their great loss on the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. You and I are both people of faith, and I know we share the deepest hope that his memory inspire acts of kindness and unity, dialogue between peoples, and hope for humanity.
In the Pontiff's homeland of Argentina, the President's office issued a statement and said Argentina deeply mourns the departure of His Holiness. Across the Asia-Pacific, leaders responded swiftly on social media following the Vatican's announcement. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi described Pope Francis as a symbol of compassion and spiritual courage and noted the pontiff's cherished ties with India. Cardinal Pablo Virgilio David, president of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, expressed shock and sorrow, calling for nationwide prayers and church bell tolls. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, prefect of the Dicastery for the Laity, lauded Pope Francis's unwavering dedication to the marginalised. He said that Pope Francis was a shepherd to those most often forgotten. May his soul find eternal peace and his legacy live on in our hearts and service. The Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, remembered Pope Francis during a morning mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan.
And here we are, this second day of Easter, this Easter Monday, hearing the news of our Holy Father's passing over. Here we are at the greatest prayer of all, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which we offer, asking the Lord's mercy on his immortal soul, thanking God for the gift that he was to us, and asking for consolation upon God's family.
As the world reflects on the legacy of a man who broke centuries of tradition to bring the papacy closer to the people, Vatican officials are preparing for an historic funeral expected to draw dignitaries and mourners from every corner of the globe.
Catholics around the world are united in grief following the death of Pope Francis. Many took the news of his passing as a shock, as the Pope had greeted crowds just days earlier in St. Peter's Square.
Pope Francis, who passed away on Monday at the age of 88, left a deep void in the hearts of Catholics around the world. While his death was expected after battling double pneumonia, it still shocked many, especially after he had greeted crowds just days earlier in St. Peter's Square. In Latin America, particularly in Argentina, Pope Francis's homeland, the grief is especially intense. As the first pope from the region, his death is deeply felt. Outside the Vatican, tourists reacted to the news with shock and sadness.
Well, I don't live in Rome. I live in Milan, and I'm here for Easter. And I find it very significant that the Pope has died during Easter, or the Easter weekend. I'm from Argentina. The Pope is Argentinian, so it has quite a bit of significance for us.
In Paris, Spain and Germany, the faithful echoed with solemn tributes. Parisians gathered as the Notre Dame bells tolled for the late pontiff. In Madrid, Catholics mourned the death of the pontiff outside the Almudena Cathedral. In the United Kingdom, at Westminster Cathedral in London, people gathered for morning prayers, reflecting on the Pope's death with deep sorrow.
It's one of those things you always know where you were when you heard the news, and I had a message from my wife just saying that the Holy Father had died, and I'd actually called her just a few minutes beforehand to come and pray, but the doors were closed. Obviously the news hadn't got out until that moment, and so I turned around and came back again and just came here for morning prayer.
He's a man of the people, represented the people, and the first pope from South America, which I'm very proud of because I used to live in Brazil.
In Cape Town, South Africa, residents of all backgrounds gathered outside St Mary's Catholic Cathedral to mourn the Pope's passing.
It's a bit sad, especially for all those Catholics around the world. It's a sad day, and many good people are come and passed on, and we hope like the next Pope could be as good as the next and leave good examples.
Nigeria's capital also expressed hope for a peaceful transition after Pope Francis's death. Meanwhile, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the faithful gathered in Bukavu at Notre Dame de la Paix Cathedral. As the bells tolled in remembrance, worshippers reflected on the Pope's dedication to DRC, where he was a beacon of hope for the oppressed. Across the Philippines, the only predominantly Catholic country in Asia, church services were filled with prayers for Pope Francis. Filipinos remembered his special connection to the country, especially his past visits and messages of hope. In South Korea's capital, Seoul, the faithful expressed their gratitude to him. As the world reflects on Pope Francis's legacy, his contributions to the world will not be forgotten.
The Vatican is preparing for a historic transition as the Church begins funeral rites and moves towards electing a new Pope.
The Pope's funeral will be held a few days after his passing in St. Peter's Square, led by the Dean of the College of Cardinals. The ceremony will follow traditional Catholic rites, but reflect the late Pope's wishes for a simpler farewell. His body will remain inside a wooden coffin with the lid removed during public viewing, rather than being displayed on a raised platform. He will be buried at the Basilica of St Mary Major to be near his favourite icon of the Madonna. The coffin will include a white silk cloth, a rogito summarising his life, and commemorative coins. The Vatican will observe a 9-day mourning period, and Italy is expected to declare a national day of mourning. Following the funeral, preparations will begin for the conclave to elect a new pope. Out of the current 252 Catholic cardinals, 138 are under the age of 80 and eligible to vote. The College of Cardinals will convene in the Sistine Chapel, where voting will continue in secrecy until one candidate secures a 2/3 majority. Up to 4 voting rounds can be held per day, and the outcome will be signalled by smoke: black for no decision, white for a successful election. Once a new pope is elected, he will choose a papal name and be presented to the public from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. He will then deliver his first blessing as the head of the Catholic Church.
With the passing of Pope Francis, attention is turning to his possible successor. The conclave to elect a new pope is expected to begin in the Vatican's Sistine Chapel within 15 to 20 days of his death. Several cardinals are being mentioned as potential successors. According to tradition, cardinals confined to the Vatican for the conclave decide the exact day of the election. All cardinals under 80 can vote, requiring a 2/3 majority plus one to elect the new pope. The process can typically take multiple rounds over several days. Just a day before his passing, in what has now become his final Easter message, Pope Francis issued a wide-ranging call for peace, urging an end to conflicts from Ukraine to the South Caucasus and beyond.
Flags are lowered at half-mast across the Vatican as the world mourns the death of Pope Francis, the 266th pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church. The 88-year-old's final Easter address, delivered just one day before, now takes on profound historical significance, a last call for peace in a fractured world. In his Easter speech, Pope Francis called for an end to the war in Ukraine, pleading for a just and lasting peace. His words underscored the devastating toll of the conflict, urging global leaders to prioritise diplomacy over escalation. Turning to the South Caucasus, the Pope appealed directly to Armenia and Azerbaijan to finalise a peace agreement. In his message, he expressed hope that reconciliation would finally bring stability to the region after years of conflict and suffering. Pope Francis also addressed the deepening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. He urged a ceasefire, the release of hostages and emergency aid for civilians, while condemning the alarming resurgence of anti-Semitism worldwide. In Syria and Lebanon, the Pope's final address called for international support for Christian communities facing isolation and hardship. He warned that centuries-old traditions risk being lost in the turmoil. He drew attention to Yemen's prolonged humanitarian disaster, urging the international community to pursue solutions through constructive dialogue and to end the suffering of innocent civilians. From Sudan to the Sahel, the pontiff highlighted conflicts he said were too often ignored by the world, calling for sustained efforts to address violence, displacement and religious persecution. In one of his most urgent warnings, Francis condemned the growing global arms race. He stressed that true peace can only be achieved through disarmament, solidarity and the defence of basic freedoms, not through fear and militarization. He also called for assistance to Myanmar's earthquake survivors and welcomed signs of a ceasefire, urging long-term peace building for a people battered by both war and natural disaster. In closing his final public message, the head of the Catholic Church warned against the logic of fear and isolationism, urging leaders to fight hunger and injustice with what he called weapons of peace, development, compassion, and human dignity.
Now let's turn to other news. A 30-hour Easter ceasefire declared by Russian President Vladimir Putin has ended with both Moscow and Kyiv accusing each other of thousands of violations. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian forces broke the truce nearly 3,000 times on Sunday, while Russia claims it repelled Ukrainian assaults and drone attacks. The Kremlin said there were no plans to extend the ceasefire. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump said he hopes for a peace deal this week without offering details. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Russia has to carefully study the Easter truce results, adding that Moscow was open to any peace initiatives and expects a similar attitude from Kyiv.
Overall, we saw a decrease in combat activity on the part of the enemy. This is true. These are assessments, including those of the commanders of our groupings. But nevertheless, there were almost 5,000 violations, 4,900. This includes 6 attacks and 90 attempted airplane-type drone attacks. I think there were 400 artillery attacks. But overall still, there has been a reduction in activity. We welcome that, and we are ready to look at the future. Regarding the proposal on ending the strikes against the civilian infrastructure, we should look into it.
Telegram founder Pavel Durov has praised France's National Assembly for rejecting a controversial bill that would have forced encrypted messaging apps to create backdoors, potentially compromising user privacy. In a post on X, Durov warned that such laws do little to stop crime and instead endanger the privacy of law-abiding citizens. He emphasised Telegram's long-standing commitment to encryption, saying the platform would rather leave a market than betray users' trust. Durov also cautioned that similar proposals are now being pushed by the European Commission. US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth shared details about an imminent attack on Houthis in Yemen in March in a second group chat using the messaging app Signal, which included his wife, his brother and his personal lawyer. The New York Times was first to report Hegseth's sharing of the details in a second Signal group. This reportedly occurred around the same time in mid-March when key members of Donald Trump's National Security Council, including Hegseth, inadvertently shared details about the March 15th missile strike in Yemen with the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. At least 12 people have been killed and 30 others wounded in a US airstrike on Yemen's capital, according to Houthi rebels. The US's Military Central Command declined to answer questions about the strike or discuss civilian casualties from its campaign. The Houthis described the strike as hitting the Farwa neighbourhood market in the capital, Sana'a. This area has been targeted by US forces before. In a bid to fast-track a trade agreement and ease tensions over tariffs, US Vice President J.D. Vance is in India this week, where he is set to talk with the country's Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
US Vice President J.D. Vance began a 4-day visit to India on Monday. He'll be holding talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi as both sides push to finalise an early trade deal and deepen ties under the Trump administration. The visit comes as India seeks to avoid steep US tax hikes by accelerating negotiations on a bilateral agreement. It focuses on fair trade and defence cooperation. They're expected to review progress on this agenda, which was set earlier this year. Meanwhile, India has reportedly signalled its willingness to reduce tariffs on more than half of its $41.8 billion worth of US imports as part of the proposed deal. Vance will also be visiting the Taj Mahal and attending a wedding in Jaipur with his family. His wife, Usha, is of Indian heritage. The trip comes after the Vice President made a stop in Rome, where he met with Pope Francis on Easter Sunday. Meanwhile, Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is in the US for a 4-day trip with meetings set with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as well as G20 finance talks. Sitharaman says India aims to conclude the first phase of this trade pact with the United States by the autumn. And India's chief trade negotiator Rajesh Agrawal will travel to Washington on Wednesday for a 3-day trip, as both sides work towards a deal within the 90-day pause on tariff hikes announced by President Donald Trump a week ago.
China has warned it will take resolute countermeasures against other countries negotiating with the US if they make a deal at China's expense during the trade war. Comments from Beijing come after reports that the US plans to pressure governments to restrict trade with China in exchange for exemptions to US tariffs.
China is accusing Washington of abusing tariffs and warns countries against striking a broader economic deal with the United States at its expense. The comments ratchets up its rhetoric in a spiraling trade war between the world's two biggest economies. The move comes as US President Donald Trump moves ahead with sweeping new tariffs, sparing most countries except China. Beijing now faces duties of up to 145%, while other nations enjoy a 90-day pause. China has threatened resolute countermeasures against any trade partners that harm its economic interests, including raising levies on American goods to 125%. The country also plans to convene an informal United Nations Security Council meeting this week, claiming America is using trade as a weapon and its impact on global development efforts. Meanwhile, Washington continues negotiations with a growing list of trade partners. Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia are among those exploring deals, some reportedly considering increased US imports and a shift away from Chinese goods. President Trump argues that the tax hikes will help revive US manufacturing, raise government revenue, and boost domestic consumption. But economists warn that undoing decades of global supply chain integration will take time and could expose global markets to short-term volatility.
The World Bank and International Monetary Fund's spring meetings are kicking off in Washington, D.C. Representatives from multiple countries are expected in Washington this week, hoping to strike a trade deal. The annual talks in Washington will focus on the fallout from the hike in American tariffs. Our correspondent Ubi Shabandar has more from Washington.
Heads of major banks and finance leaders from across the globe are in Washington this week for the biannual meeting of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as pressure mounts on some of the world's largest economies to finalize a trade deal with the world's largest economy, the United States. The meetings this week will include direct bilateral and multilateral talks between finance ministers seeking foreign investment and project financing, and for some, seeking approval for debt relief. Tariffs will, of course, dominate discussions among world finance leaders, as a number of countries scramble to close bilateral trade deals with Washington in the hopes of staving off massive spikes in the tariffs that were ordered by President Trump. Japan and the United Kingdom are among some of the countries that will have senior trade and treasury officials in Washington this week, hoping to strike a deal with the administration. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said last week that the World Economic Outlook's growth projection will include, quote, notable markdowns, but not recessions. President Trump's additional reciprocal tariffs are paused for 90 days, but a 10% general tariff across all countries will be in effect. And there doesn't seem to be any signs that Trump's massive tariffs on China will be negotiated down anytime soon. Meanwhile, World Bank President Ajay Banga is expected to include nuclear and gas projects into the bank's financing portfolio, a move that will likely be appreciated by the Trump White House. Trump's Liberation Day tariffs have shaken up global economic norms, and that seems just fine with the White House. Behind the scenes, finance ministers from around the world will hold meetings with their American counterparts to negotiate a reduction in the tariffs before the 90-day pause expires. In that context, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will be sitting down with representatives from at least a dozen separate countries as IMF and World Bank officials hope to reassure a Trump administration that has been skeptical of traditional economic globalists. Treasury Secretary Bessent will give a speech on Wednesday that is expected to outline U.S. priorities for the IMF and the World Bank. IMF Managing Director Georgieva has said that the subsequent trade deals that might emerge from President Trump's unprecedented reset of the global trade networks may, quote, in her words, add some additional vibrancy to the global economy. So clearly here, tariffs will be on everybody's minds as world financial leaders gather in the American capital. I'm Ube Shabander for A News in Washington, D.C.
The US dollar continued to slide on Monday, falling to its lowest level since 2022, as tensions between President Trump and the Federal Reserve spooked global investors. The Intercontinental Exchange, which tracks the dollar against a basket of major currencies, dropped below the 99 mark, hitting a low of 97.92 before slightly recovering. Analysts say the decline reflects growing uncertainty over US monetary policy and investor confidence in American assets. A new round of indirect US-Iran nuclear talks, this time on an expert level, is set for Wednesday in Oman. Iran's foreign ministry said that parties are currently developing general principles for conducting the talks. Following Wednesday's discussions, the next talks of delegations, headed by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, are set for Saturday. The Omani Foreign Ministry said after the second round of talks in Rome, the two sides were discussing a deal that would allow Iran to retain the opportunity to develop peaceful nuclear energy. Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to host Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev in Beijing this week as part of a state visit. The talks will focus on strengthening strategic ties between the two nations, with cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative high on the agenda. According to China's Foreign Ministry, relations between Beijing and Baku have seen steady growth in recent years, marked by deepening political trust and expanding international collaboration.
During the visit, President Xi will hold talks with President Aliyev and draw a new blueprint for the China-Azerbaijan relationship. Premier Li Qiang and Chairman Zhao Leiji will meet with President Aliyev, respectively, and have in-depth exchange of views on cooperation in various fields. We believe that this visit will further deepen the China-Azerbaijan strategic partnership and bring more benefits to the people of the two countries.
Azerbaijan and China discussed enhancing their investment partnership, focusing on joint business initiatives and mutual interests. The China-Azerbaijan Industrial and Investment Cooperation Promotion Conference, held in Beijing with nearly 200 participating companies, was highlighted as a key platform for advancing bilateral cooperation. A memorandum of understanding signed between AzPromo and China's NDRC is expected to boost Chinese investment in Azerbaijan and deepen economic collaboration. The second Turkic Trade Fair Forum, an exhibition on trade and investment cooperation among Turkic states, will take place at the Baku Expo Centre from June the 10th, according to the Organisation of Turkic States. This major business event aims to strengthen collaboration in industry, investment, technology and services among OTS member and observer states, while also promoting access to global markets. The fair will feature products and innovations across more than 20 sectors. Expert-led conferences will also be broadcast on-site, covering investment opportunities, key industries, business challenges and practical solutions. The first edition of the forum was held at the Istanbul Exhibition Centre in November last year. Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has criticised the country's past and present constitutions, saying they do not reflect the will of the people. Pashinyan proposed that the new constitution should not reference the Declaration of Independence and announced plans for a referendum in 2027. Some in his team suggest holding it alongside the 2026 parliamentary elections. Pashinyan considers the changes an internal matter, but says they could have serious regional and international consequences. Joining me now from Cambridge is international lawyer Javid Rahimli. Thanks for joining us, Javid. So, Armenia says that the latest ruling of the Constitutional Court has removed what Azerbaijan refers to as a constitutional obstacle towards the conclusion of the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace deal. What's your legal analysis of this?
Thank you for the invitation. From a legal perspective, Armenia's claim that its Constitutional Court has removed all constitutional obstacles to peace with Azerbaijan is not convincing and remains open to a valid criticism. The main issue is Armenia's 1999 Declaration of Independence, which is directly referenced in the preamble of the Armenian Constitution. That declaration includes reference to the 1989 decision to unify with Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia. For Azerbaijan, this has long raised concerns that Armenia's constitution includes territorial claims against it. In its 2024 decision, the Armenian Constitutional Court ruled that only those ideas from the declaration that are also stated in the main text of the Constitution have legal force. According to the majority, the declaration has historical or symbolic value, but does not create any binding constitutional rule. However, Judge Mr. Tovmasyan disagreed. In his dissent opinion, he argued that the declaration still carries legal weight. He said the reference to it in the Constitution means that its content continues to influence how constitutional rules are interpreted. Ignoring this, he warned, weakens the legal foundations of Armenian statehood and leaves important issues unresolved. Importantly, the court did not propose removing the reference to the declaration. This means that different interpretations are still possible in the future, including by political leaders or judges, who may see the declaration as continuing to reflect Armenia's claim to Nagorno-Karabakh. For Azerbaijan, this keeps the situation uncertain. Unless Armenia takes formal steps, such as changing the constitution, to remove or clarify the legal meaning of the declaration, its current position is incomplete. It does not guarantee a stable legal foundation for a peace agreement. In short, the decision limits how the declaration is interpreted, but it does not remove it from the Armenian's legal system. As a result, the issue remains open and unsettled in law.
Now, Armenian officials, they say the 1990 declaration is merely symbolic and not legally binding, so they're questioning why Azerbaijan is still insisting on this. Are Azerbaijan's objections still valid?
Yes, I believe Azerbaijan's objectives are still valid based on Armenia's own legal history. The 1990 Declaration of Independence is directly mentioned in the preamble of Armenia's constitution. That preamble is not just introductory language, it's a part of the constitution and is listed as one of the provisions that cannot be amended. It includes a reference to the decision to unify with Nagorno-Karabakh. Even though Armenia's constitutional court said that only parts of the declaration repeated in the main body of the constitution have legal effect, this position contradicts with the court's judgment. In 2010 decision, the court ruled that the provisions of the declaration could limit how Armenia interprets its agreement with Turkey. That shows the declaration has previously been used to restrict international agreements. If it had legal effect then, it cannot be dismissed as symbolic now. Also, in its dissent opinion, Judge Mr. Tovmasan also mentioned that ignoring the court's own past judgment is a violation of the constitutional law of the Republic of Armenia on the Constitutional Court. Also, since the preamble is unchangeable, it can only be removed through a completely new constitution, not by ordinary amendments. Armenian officials have recently suggested that a new constitution could be adopted if approved by referendum. This shows that they know the reference is still a problem, and they might be using this discussion to gain an advantage in negotiations. Until the reference is clearly removed or its legal effect formally ended, Azerbaijan's position remains justified, and the risk is real, and it is based on Armenia's own constitutional structure and past legal practice.
All very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for this.
Well, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan met with his Algerian counterpart Ahmed Attaf during his official visit to Algiers. To further strengthen bilateral ties, Fidan is expected to co-chair the third meeting of the Turkey-Algeria Joint Planning Group alongside Attaf. Afghanistan and Kazakhstan have taken major steps towards deepening their economic partnership, following high-level talks in Kabul that resulted in a comprehensive roadmap for trade expansion and infrastructure development. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
Afghanistan and Kazakhstan are set to significantly boost their economic ties following a high-level meeting in Kabul. Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs Mullah Abdul Ghani Brother met with Kazakhstan's Deputy Prime Minister Serik Zomangarin at the Gulkhana Palace. The two sides discussed expanding cooperation across key sectors, including trade, agriculture, mining, transport, and industry. Mullah Brother highlighted shared interest and growing trade between the two nations, emphasizing Afghanistan's commitment to regional economic integration. A roadmap has been signed to raise bilateral trade to $3 billion, with new agreements in agriculture, livestock, mining, and railway transport underway. Kazakhstan pledged $500 million to help implement the Turgundi-Herat railway project and proposed setting up a logistic company in Herat. Zomangarin also announced plans for an internet cable project to provide affordable access and expressed readiness to invest in Afghanistan's mining, oil, and gas sectors. Both sides agreed to resume Kabul-Astana flights, ease visa processes, and enhance banking cooperation. Later, Kazakh's Deputy Prime Minister also met with Afghanistan's acting Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi to discuss bilateral issues. Separately, Kazakhstan's ambassador in Kabul met with Afghanistan's acting Minister of Public Works to explore further investment opportunities, particularly in railway development and transit infrastructure. The discussion underscored a shared interest in turning Afghanistan into a key trade and transit hub for the region. This is Tamim Bahis in Kabul for A News.
You were watching A News. Thank you for staying with us. Have a wonderful evening.